we are going to be looking at derivatives of inverse functions, not just inverse trig functions. So, first question for you is, what are inverse functions? Do you remember that to find an inverse function, if I give you something like y equals 2x plus 4, the inverse is when you switch x and y around. So we would have x equals 2y plus 4. So we'd find the inverse by now solving for y here. So we would subtract 4, then divide by 2. So we would have 1/2 x minus 2 equals y. And do you remember we called that the inverse of y? We used a little -1. The important thing that you need to know here today is that when we had inverse functions, we also learned that if we have an inverse function here, we'll call this function f. So we'll call this f of x for what we're going to do. If we think about this and we find points, in this problem when x is 0, y is 4. So f of 0 is 4. Let's take a look at the inverse. If we have the inverse when x is 4, y is 0. Plug 4 here, 1/2 of 4 is 2 minus 2 gives us 0. So you remember we said before that when we have inverses, x and y are switched. So in f of x, I'm going to call this g of x, so this is going to be the g of x. So what we're going to say today, or what we're going to be looking at tomorrow in class, is that when we have f of x, g will be the inverse of f. So g is going to be the inverse. That means f of 0 is 4, so that means g of 4 is 0. That's the key that you need to know. That's the critical information. How does that relate to us? Well, let's just take that example that I had there. F of 0 was 4, which makes g of 4 0. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be finding the derivative of the inverse. And if you look on your first page of your notes, so when we go back here, we have g prime of 4, by the definition that's on your notes there, is going to be 1 over f prime of g of 4. So it's going to be 1 over f prime at g, or at 0. So it's going to be the reciprocal. This is the critical part. It's going to be the reciprocal, right here. This derivative is going to be the reciprocal of the derivative of f at 0. So at f's x value. G's x value is 4, but because they're inverses, that's really the x value of 0 for f. You see what I'm talking about? So the derivative of the inverse is 1 over, it's the reciprocal of the derivative of the original function at the original function's x value. That's just a preview for what we're going to talk about tomorrow in class. This is the definition of derivative of inverse functions, right here. Notice it says g prime of b equals 1 over f prime of g of b. So, go back here.